Hello and welcome to Hamilton the Podcast. I'm Vinton Bayne.
And I'm Robbie Hurlocker. Today we're talking about the two songs, Dear Theodosia and
Non-Stop.
So I really like this song, Dear Theodosia, a lot. It's
a real sweet song.
It's so sweet. It's so beautiful. It's almost like a lullaby that these fathers are singing to their newborn kids. It's so precious to me.
Yeah, you said it's kind of like a lullaby. And the tone of this song is actually kind of borrowed a little bit from a couple of other songs. There's this thing called the Hamthology playlists.
Mm-hmm.
They're on Spotify, and a couple of the people in charge over at the Hamilton musical put this together to show some of the songs that inspired the musical.
Yeah, I heard about that.
There's a couple here that are directly related to this song. They're both by the Decemberists. Lin-Manuel Miranda picked Red Right Ankle, and the musical director, Alex Lacamoire, picked June Hymn. But on top of this, there's actually another song that a lot of people have talked about it sharing a similarity in tone with, and that's the song Hey There Delilah by the Plain White T's. Now, there haven't been any official connection to that being an inspiration to this, but a lot of people have said that, and listening to the both of them, it's true. They do sound very similar.
That makes me like this song a little bit less, though.
Oh, no.
No, I love, when it first came out, I really loved Hey There Delilah. I would listen to it a lot, and then I would hear it everywhere, and you know how that works.
All right.
But yeah, Dear Theodosia is fantastic. I love those songs really do kind of capture that spirit of the lullaby, the sweetness of what this is. I love that you see two fathers just doting over their newborn kids.
Yeah.
Actually, I have a box in my house right now where I have some just important letters that have been written to me personally throughout my life. And one of them is, a couple of them actually, are written by my own dad. And I found one in there,
awesome.
right before we started recording. I just grabbed it, and it's been a bookmark in one of the Aaron Burr biographies I'm reading. But it says, "Dear Robbie," and I won't read this whole thing to you because I'll probably cry or get emotional or something. There's one part in the first paragraph where he says, "I never thought I could ever feel as proud as the day I carried you out of the operating room to the nursery. But boy, was I wrong. I've been so proud of you so often." And I could go on, but it makes me emotional just listening to my dad's words for me.
Yeah.
And to me, that's what this song is. It's
great.
It's two fathers holding their children and just expressing how much hope they have, how much optimism they have, how much these kids are their consuming passion, their desire, their heart. So often you see in media that there's a hesitancy in fathers to just express that type of a love and to embrace those emotions that are really seen as almost feminine emotions in certain contexts. But here, Aaron Burr and Alexander Hamilton sit down in front of their newborn kids, and they are just pouring out emotional love for their kids.
Yeah, and Lin-Manuel Miranda himself had a child around this time, and someone actually asked him on Twitter if his son had inspired him a little bit, the birth of his son had inspired him a little bit in writing this song, and he replied to them that when he wrote the song, his son hadn't been born yet, but they did adopt a puppy that week. So I don't know if that was a little bit of tongue-in-cheek, or if he actually was inspired by this new puppy a little bit.
Well, my sister and brother-in-law would absolutely say that counts.
But I'm sure it took on new meaning for him after his son was born.
Oh, yeah, I'm sure. So on the staging of this musical, do you know exactly how they execute this on stage, Vinton?
So I think this is actually one of the least physical parts of the musical. To my knowledge, they stand behind two chairs, and I think Burr maybe sits in one throughout part of it. But they mostly just kind of stand in the same position with these two chairs while they sing through this song.
I actually kind of like that idea of a simplistic setting for this particular, simplistic staging for this song, because it is a very powerful, emotional song that I think the emotional weight of it really does carry it.
Yeah, definitely.
And for such a kinetic show where every song almost has the ensemble moving constantly behind the main cast members, you get to this moment and it is almost a stirring, somber moment.
Yeah, it's that somber quietness of here's your chance to rest and reflect.
Yeah.
That's kind of what you get from them coming out of the war. They just finished a war. There's been all this hecticness, and now they have a chance to come home and sit and reflect, and they see their newborn children here after the war, soon after, and they have a chance to just be quiet and calm for a moment.
Yeah, I like that a lot. We talked a little bit last week about how this song and the next one kind of answers the question that King George just asked, what comes next? And for Aaron Burr and Alexander Hamilton,
Babies!
babies come next. First comes independence, then comes revolution, then comes the baby in the baby carriage.
That doesn't rhyme.
No, it doesn't. I'm sorry. I should have thought of that instead of just spitballing. I'm no Lin-Manuel Miranda.
So we first hear from Burr here singing to his newborn daughter. And she has the same name as her mother.
Yeah, that's pretty confusing the first time listening through this soundtrack. If you don't know, because if you're thinking back, you remember that he was marrying a woman named Theodosia, and now he is actually singing to Dear Theodosia, you have my eyes. Wait, that's a little bit bizarre to say to your wife, and you have your mother's name. Okay, strange.
Something's wrong here.
And when you came into the world, you cried, and it broke my... If you don't understand the staging, it really can throw you for a loop.
Yeah. Like you said, we mentioned Theodosia, the woman that Burr would marry, the Theodosia Sr. here, in a previous song that we did about Burr. I don't think we mentioned her dying, though, and she will die about 10 years or so, almost 11 years after Theodosia Jr. here is born.
Yeah, young Theo, as they called her sometimes, didn't get to know her mom past her 11th birthday.
And that will be important in the lyrics here in the song because you see a few things come up that kind of reverberate from that.
Yeah, it's almost worth noting here that Aaron Burr and Theodosia Prevost, when they got married, that this Theodosia is their first child. And a few different sources have pointed out that she's the only child of their couple that actually survived into adulthood.
Right. I did a lot of research looking for the other children, and I'm sure it's on there. I didn't delve so deep to try to find all the names and everything, but I did notice that in 5 different places I looked, verbatim had the same phrase. She was the only child of the Burrs to live to adulthood. And that's all they said about it, as if they didn't even care who the other children were, and they definitely weren't going to list them.
Oh, man. I did actually come across the kind of history of their family a little bit.
Oh, good.
In Milton Lomask's biography, he has a 2-volume biography. I think we mentioned it in our Aaron Burr episode, which you should go back and listen to it. It's episode 5 of our podcast if you haven't heard it yet. But in this particular portion of his biography in chapter 6, he points out that Theodosia wanted to name their firstborn child Sally. After visiting Aaron Burr's in-laws, Aaron Burr's sisters named Sally or Sarah, she went by both names, and Aaron Burr insisted on honoring Theodosia specifically. It wasn't very common to name daughters after mothers.
Yeah, I think that's still not very common today.
Yeah, it's true. But Aaron Burr was insistent. He wanted to honor Theodosia and the naming of their first daughter by naming little Theo after her. But they did end up having another daughter named Sally later on in their marriage. Just a couple of years later, and then they had 2 other stillbirths.
Oh, man.
Yeah, and they had...
sad.
It was heartbreaking, and it was devastating for the couple themselves. Senior Theodosia actually got pretty sick, and she spent the end of her days really under the weather and suffering a lot. Actually, a lot of the correspondence that Aaron Burr had with his daughter Theodosia, and when she was still only 10 years old, was asking specifically for young Theo to report on her mother's illness. Oh, man. And so it was kind of an interesting dynamic where he was trying to educate her, trying to get her in the habit of writing, and trying to keep her active and engaged in everything that was happening. I don't know exactly what happened to their daughter Sally when she died, but she died as a very, very young infant, specifically, was basically the impression I got from reading about her death. And Theodosia, Aaron's wife, was such a poetic woman, such a well-educated woman, and such a strong, emotional person in their life that she wrote this really, really heartbreaking letter shortly after their daughter Sally's death. And let me just read this portion from Lomask's biography here. Variegated have been the scenes of my anguish, but this exceeds them all. A tender, affectionate friend just opening into life, and flushed with health till the sly viper stole upon her vitals, there preyed, unperceiving, till too late. All aid proved vain, she passed gently from me to the regions of bliss. Yes, my Sally, she is gone.
Man, it's heartbreaking.
It is so heartbreaking. Aaron Burr's life was surrounded by so much pain early on, and then for his own children to be taken from him like this, it's really sad.
Right.
But in this particular song in the musical, the letter from the father to the daughter is much more optimistic, much more hope-filled, much more encouraging, and just casting a vision for the way his young Theo is going to live her life.
Yeah, and I had read that previously to being on Broadway, there used to be a portion of the musical covering the death of Theodosia Sr., his wife.
Oh,
but they
neat.
had to, I
Interesting.
guess, cut it out because it got confusing with the name Theodosia getting repeated and who he was talking about.
It's like
there
an
was some
early
confusion there.
Early draft of the musical had that. That's interesting. I'd love to be able to dive into some of those. I'd like to get the director's cut.
Yeah,
Like
right.
all of the things that Lin-Manuel didn't have time to fit into the musical.
I want to see the deleted scenes.
Right. Talking about that actually brings up a moment. We have an announcement to make about next week's special episode, and so stay tuned to the end of the episode to figure out what that is.
Yeah. So in the lyrics here, you have Burr saying domestic life was never quite his style, which, as we talked about, after the first decade of his daughter's life, it's going to have to be because he now has to take the place of mother and father.
Yeah, he becomes a single dad pretty early on.
And throughout his daughter's life, he did raise her in such a way that she was almost like a son in the way the education that he gave her and the way he raised her. He gave her all those benefits, very much a feminist upbringing.
Yeah, he fought for women to be educated to the same level as men, and he thought that it was ridiculous that his own daughter wouldn't have the absolute best books at her disposal. He taught her Greek, he taught her to read the classics, he taught her French, and taught her how to study everything she needed to know in order to engage in a really intellectual public sphere.
And throughout the life of his daughter, they kept up a rigorous correspondence. They wrote a lot of letters back and forth to each other.
Right. They actually got to a point where some of their letters later on are a little bit risque and a little strange because
Really?
Usually when a father is writing to his daughter, even if she is a grown-up daughter by this time, you don't usually see that the single dad is going to be talking about the ladies he's shacking up with his daughter. I imagine she just writes back with TMI, Dad, TMI. But yeah, they got pretty intimate in their correspondence because Aaron Burr did not want to hide anything from her. Didn't feel like he had to talk down to her like someone who was not his equal. He was able to just speak to her as someone that he respected, as he would write to another peer of his.
I would like to point out, though, that Burr was very much in love with the elder Theodosia Sr. here. And it would be quite a few years after she died that he would remarry. And he would write these things about her. I've read like a certain excerpt from a letter that said that she was the best of women that he ever knew.
Yeah, that's interesting because Aaron Burr does get the reputation later in his life of becoming this rake, this person who basically ends up seducing a rich lady, moving in with her, taking all her funds, and running. And so there are some periods of time in his later life. I really hope at the end of this particular podcast and at the end of the musical, we're going to be able to have a particular episode we dedicate specifically to the Burr conspiracy and everything that happened at the end of his life. But it is worth noting that in their actual family setting, he was well known for being a very respectful, loyal father and loyal husband.
And then there's that line, "You knock me out, I fall apart," which is sung by Burr here, but it will be repeated later by Hamilton in a much sadder tone in It's Quiet Uptown.
Oh, yeah, that song. I think everyone that has heard that song knows how heartbreaking that song is.
Yeah, it's probably the saddest song on this whole thing.
Right, that's very true.
So then it says, "You will come of age with our young nation. We'll bleed and fight for you. We'll make it right for you." And it's interesting to me that this song kind of takes on this perspective of being to the two children, obviously, but maybe there's a third child here. There is the child that is the nation, this newborn baby of a nation that they're having to take care of. And they're singing to these two new children they have, but kind of the nation's a new child of theirs as well that they have to now raise. They have to raise up to be a great nation, a great, adult nation. And it's their job to see after it and make sure it doesn't get sick and die or that it learns right, just like you have to with a child.
Yeah, I think that the parallel themes there are just unavoidable. I mean, when we're talking about the founding fathers, you talk about fatherhood.
Right.
And so it was not certain what would happen out of the American experiment. So it was almost like our nation was in that cradle and everyone is watching saying, what are you going to do? Where are you going to go?
Right.
Where is this history going to take us?
And even at the end of this verse, when he starts saying, "You'll blow us all away. Someday you'll blow us all away." And of course, they're singing that to their children, but I like to think that they're singing that to the nation. And they have these hopes and dreams and this pride for this nation that they're starting. But specifically to the children, the revolution was a gift to the next generation who wouldn't know the fighting of the war and they wouldn't know the oppression of the British government. This would be something brand new for them. And it would be a gift from the parents. And that's that parental viewpoint of, it's okay if I suffer as long as my child gets to experience the freedom.
Yeah, it's like, this is the reason they were fighting. This is what they were fighting for, to be able to pass it on to their children. And I like to draw the connection here between the earlier song at the very beginning of the musical where Alexander Hamilton gets a little tipsy and he starts singing soberly. And if we win our independence, is that a guarantee of freedom for our descendants? Or will the blood we shed begin an endless cycle of vengeance and death with no defendants? So he even early on was saying that the thing we're doing in laying the groundwork for a new nation, the thing we're doing in actually setting out to build a new country, a new government, this is for our future generations. This is something we want to last. We're doing this so that there is freedom for our descendants, so that our kids can live in a better world than the one where we have lived.
Yeah, and so those children are now tasked with the job of making this nation better after their mothers and fathers. And we see that they have high expectations here. You'll blow us all away someday. They just know that their children are going to do great things. Now, as we know in the musical, this has kind of an ironic tone to it because both of these parents will outlive the children that they're singing to.
Oh, that is so true. That just hit me in the heart when you said that. It's so heartbreaking.
Yeah. So especially young for Philip, but a little bit later in life, Theodosia will also die in a shipwreck on the way to see her father.
Yeah, Aaron Burr's daughter, Theodosia, and his grandson, Aaron Burr III, were actually killed, and he lost them and outlived them, and it really did a number on him, I think. No father should have to bury their kids.
Yeah.
Man, I feel, Vinton, like we're taking a really optimistic, happy song, and we're kind of talking about the sad moments around it.
Right.
So,
let's turn this thing around and get back on track here.
Let's turn it all around.
So here's an excerpt I wrote down from a letter, one of only 2 letters apparently we have from Hamilton to his son Philip.
Oh, I'm interested in hearing this.
For I know that you can do a great deal if you please, and I am sure you have too much spirit not to exert yourself, that you may make us every day more and more proud of you.
Mm.
And that goes into this line where Hamilton's about to say, look at my son. Pride is not the word I'm looking for.
Man, for a guy who throughout this entire musical is usually not speechless, his words are not like he opens his mouth and gives his enemies free ammunition with every word he says. But here he's like, pride isn't the word I'm looking for. What is it?
If you're looking for a word, Hamilton has 5 for you.
Right.
And here he cannot find the right one.
He says, there's so much more inside of me right now. And so he turns to poetry. He says, Philip, you outshine the morning sun, my son.
So one of the most powerful parts of this musical is where you hear both Hamilton and Burr say, my father wasn't around.
Yeah, I love that effect of one of them echoing the other.
Yeah.
Because it does parallel their lives.
It does. They both have this parallel. Hamilton's father wasn't really around. If he was, in fact, James Hamilton, even when Hamilton invited him to come over to the new country and be with him and be present, he denied that request.
Mm-hmm.
And perhaps Hamilton's father was another person, but either way, he wasn't involved in Hamilton's upbringing in his life very much. And Burr was a true orphan.
And continuing the pattern of how this musical parallels modern contemporary society, it is pretty telling that in a hip-hop musical, we have a song about fatherhood. And we have a song about 2 dads who are promising to be there for their kids. And they're saying, my dad was never here. I'm going to be a good dad. My dad wasn't here to raise me and to train me up. I'm not going to repeat the mistakes that guy made. I'm not going to abandon you. I'm not going to leave you alone in this world. I'm going to take care of you. I'm going to be a good dad. I'm going to be better for you.
Yeah, and that's a common theme in hip-hop culture, both in the music and in the reality of the people who produce that music.
Yeah, I think this is one of those moments in the musical where a lot of people can come to it and feel a connection of sorts.
Right. So they both say, I swear that I'll be around for you. And it's just, that moment's so powerful emotionally.
Mm-hmm.
I know we've already said that, but just so good.
Yeah, and I love the vulnerability that comes out in that where Hamilton says, I'll do whatever it takes. And Burr says, I'll make a million mistakes.
Right. And you'll see Burr making good on this promise, I'll be around for you. When the duel comes up at the end of this whole musical, he says, this man will not make an orphan of my daughter.
Yes. In that portion of the song, you hear that Leslie Odom Jr., who's had such a clear, pure voice throughout this entire musical, who sings with such smooth tones, when he actually says that line, this man will not make an orphan of my daughter, his voice cracks a little bit. Yeah. He gets dry-throated and he starts singing, this man will not make an orphan of my daughter. And that in itself, that performance is Oh, breathtaking.
Yeah, and you see here that Burr says specifically, I'll make a million mistakes. And it's interesting to me that Burr is this calculated planner who's willing to wait and think about everything he does so that it happens just the right way. But he's fine with making a million mistakes with his dollar. He's like, you know what? I'm not going to wait. I'm going to do everything the right way. I'm going to be here for you. I'll make mistakes if I have to. That's fine. I'll ditch my philosophy for you.
That's interesting because this is definitely one of those turning points in each other's lives where they're making a new commitment of what they're going to live for.
And you kind of see Hamilton himself here saying that this is what's important to him now, that his family is important to him and that he's going to be around. And you see this in a letter that he wrote to a friend about his wife and child. He said, I lose all taste for the pursuits of ambition. I sigh for nothing but the company of my wife and baby. But we'll see in the next song that that's not as fully 100% true as he would want it to be here.
Yeah, he definitely still has this conundrum in front of him where he will constantly be presented with, are you going to pursue the family lifestyle or are you going to pursue the public lifestyle? And over again, that choice is put on Hamilton's plate, and constantly over and over again, he feels conflicted, but ultimately sides with his public reputation, his public legacy.
But as a final note for this song, these two men who disagree on a lot to the point where it kind of culminates at the end of this musical actually have something to agree on here. And they sing in unison at the end. Both of them singing together. Finally, they have something to agree on. And it's how they view their children and what they want to do for their children. And that brings us to our next song. And if you're listening to the cast album, that next song would be Nonstop. However, if you're seeing this musical live, that next song would be Tomorrow There'll Be More of Us, which is a song that was left off the cast recording about the death of John Laurens.
Yeah, so we've talked before about how if you sit down with the cast album, you can hear almost every single word of this entire musical, but that one particular song was kept out of the album so that audience goers could see something new on the stage and have a new experience of that particular scene. And he left out that particular scene because it is the most spoken scene. Instead of it being words that are rapped or words that are sung to one another, it's actually more of a narration of the letter that they're actually reading.
And we're actually going to skip over this for now. Next week, during our act break, during our intermission episode, we're going to do a little bit of a special episode for you guys.
Right.
And it's going to be covering this song that's been cut out from the recording and a few other people who didn't get as much coverage in the musical historically here.
Right.
And maybe a few other apocryphal songs. Who knows?
Yeah, so in the $10 episode about our $10 founding father.
That's right.
We're going
Hamilton
to
episode.
Yeah. We're going to highlight those people from American history who played a big role in the events surrounding Hamilton's life up until this point when the Revolutionary War was finished, who did not get to appear in this particular musical. We'll talk about people like Benedict Arnold, who played a huge role in the American Revolutionary War, and we'll talk about how Hamilton was actually there the very day that Benedict Arnold's betrayal was discovered.
But for now, we're going to jump to our next song, Nonstop.
Mm-hmm. So in this song, you see that Aaron Burr and Hamilton have stood up. They're no longer sitting there singing to their children. It's time for them to get back to work. They have so much work to do. And so Burr stands up, says, after the war, I go back to New York. And Hamilton echoes him, saying, after the war, I went back to New York. Burr says, I finished up my studies and practiced law. Hamilton says, I practiced law. Burr worked next door.
Yeah, this song is going to cover Hamilton's life from the end of the war all the way up until him getting appointed as Secretary of Treasury. And you see here that both him and Burr are starting at the same place.
Yeah, their life has been very similar to one another. And here's one of those moments where you see them absolutely following the same trajectory with their life, but with very different philosophies throughout it all.
So Hamilton takes a 3-year law course and he completes it in 6 months. That guy is nonstop.
Oh, yeah. I had heard that he didn't really go back to actually finish his degree. He didn't go back to a college to study those things. He sat down with the law books and he just devoured all of them in that 6-month time, basically cramming in so many things into this short amount of time so that he could study on his own. He made his own notes and passed the bar without having gone through that whole 3-year study at a university.
Yeah, and it was actually Burr who came in and petitioned that veterans from the Revolutionary War would be able to kind of pick up where they left off and have a little bit more of an advantage when it comes to getting back into their studies and getting a degree.
Yeah, because a lot of the people who were their peers had stopped college in order to go take up arms against the British soldiers. So since Hamilton and Burr both practiced law inside of New York City, they were actually involved in most of the major court cases of that era. They either had one of their names attached to the case. Often they were both on opposite sides of the trial. Sometimes they were on the same side. We're about to talk about a court case that was really influential that comes up later in this song. But there's one little anecdote I wanted to point out from Ron Chernow's biography where he talks about a tale that was told by James Parton, one of the early Aaron Burr biographers, who actually talks about the first time that the two men jointly defended a particular client together. And the question came up in the case about who would speak first, who would have the opening statement, and who would sum up the case. Protocol kind of said that the lead attorney, the one that's in charge of it all, would be the one to do the summation. And Hamilton insisted and wished that he would be the one to do that. Burr was apparently so offended at that patent vanity that he would be like, why do you assume you're the smartest in the room? Like that vanity of Hamilton saying, I'm the professional here. I'm the one who should get to be the lead and do the summation. Burr was so offended by that in his opening speech, he actually tried to anticipate all of the points that Hamilton would likely make in the end.
Right. And he does such a good job of it that Hamilton is, for one of the few times in his life, left speechless.
Yeah, he's embarrassed. He is just the words are taken away from him. He anticipated everything. Hamilton stands up. He's like, yeah, I got nothing.
Yeah, you covered it.
What he said. So if it's true, that was one of the first moments where Burr kind of got the upper hand in their relationship there.
So here in the song, we jump straight into the Levi Weeks case. And this is a case where Hamilton and Burr both were in defense of this man, Levi Weeks, who was accused of murdering his girlfriend.
Yeah, this was a really high-profile case where Levi Weeks had been kind of dragged through the newspapers. They had printed broadsides about him for weeks and weeks, where it became really difficult for the court to actually find an impartial jury. For weeks, the entire city was talking about how there were reports of ghosts around the well where this girl was, I'm doing air quotes now, murdered and specifically thrown into this well to her death. I say air quotes because we don't know. The whole case is about whether or not they could ever prove that Levi Weeks was the lover who turned murderer of his fiancée.
And while this case was, like in the song, the first big murder trial of our new country, at least it was the oldest one that we have record of.
Right.
It wasn't actually until the year 1800, so it was a bit after where this musical places it.
Yeah, brings it a little bit earlier so you can see their law practice and then jump straight into the Washington administration and the presidency that starts off in the very first song of the second act. So they kind of condense it really early on just to kind of make that point.
So you see here Hamilton, as he usually does, running off the mouth a little bit, and he then calls Burr his assistant counsel, which Burr then corrects. Co-counsel. I am your co-counsel.
Yeah, I'm not here to assist you. And
yeah, you see that overzealous spirit that Hamilton has coming out there. And Burr again corrects him. He then says, our client, Levi Weeks, is innocent. Call your first witness. That's all you had to say, Hamilton.
Okay. Yeah.
To which then Hamilton, in true fashion, says, okay, one more thing.
Yeah.
Dives right back in.
This really does speak to their different first, just personality styles that we've seen throughout the musical, but also their lawyering styles. When people were talking about how these two separate men were in the courtroom, we have a lot of evidence about a lot of transcripts of speeches that Hamilton gave. Most of Aaron Burr's speeches are not recorded. In fact, the Levi Weeks case is where we have one of the most well-documented speeches that he actually gave, and it was really just the stenographer's notes about his speech, not his own notes. And so here, he did have a reputation, though, for being more anecdotal, more conversational, just talking to the jury, kind of making these little points here and there. And then Hamilton would say, well, let me give you the 10 Latin words that mean you have to let this person go. Let me give you all of the facts that have led up to this point. Let me list out all of the big detailed arguments for why this case needs to go our way. And it was just very different arguing styles, very different methods of persuasion.
Yeah, I actually have a quote here by a General Erastus Root. And it says, Burr would say as much in half an hour as Hamilton in 2 hours. Burr was terse and convincing, while Hamilton was flowing and rapturous. So basically, Hamilton smothered his opponents with arguments and words, while Burr waited and planned for the perfect thing to say so that he could overcome the case.
Right. And I like that later in this song, Hamilton actually acknowledges how that type of a direct, to the point, succinct and persuasive argument has its good moments, has its particular benefits in the way you needed to act in a courtroom sometimes.
So to go back to the case a little bit more here, like we said, Levi was accused of murdering his girlfriend, of pushing her into a well, basically.
Mm-hmm.
And Hamilton and Burr, among others, were hired to be his defense by, I think, his richer brother.
And so the question has actually come up a lot when I was reading about this particular court case about how could a young carpenter actually afford a defense team with Aaron Burr on the ticket, with Hamilton on the ticket, Livingston, and as many as 6 actual lawyers in his whole defense team.
Oh, man.
Like, this was like the Cochran style, like the O.J. Simpson trial. You have a team of stellar lawyers who are out there defending this guy who, in this particular case, didn't have the money that O.J. Simpson did, who was actually not as high profile, but there was a high profile thing happening at that time, and it was the election of 1800.
Oh, yeah.
And so this whole thing is going down. You have the Federalists who are trying to get out there and spread their message and get famous and try to put forward John Adams on the ticket. And you have the Anti-Federalists who are trying to put forward the Thomas Jefferson, Aaron Burr ticket. And so they're seeing that right now in New York City, literally all eyes are on the Levi Weeks case. Everybody is watching Levi Weeks and what is happening there. And the entire city is engaged in what's happening. So it's like these lawyers are showing up saying this is free press. Like, this is time to put our name out there and so get that name recognition a little bit. And so you have people from multiple sides saying, well, yeah, I'm willing to represent the most noteworthy case in recent history.
So these lawyers asserted that Levi's girlfriend had jumped into the well herself, that she was depressed and had committed suicide. And they ended up actually winning the case.
Yeah.
They won the case by basically proving that there was reasonable doubt. And this was the first trial where this was brought up in the American court system to this point. And it's where we get our modern concept of reasonable doubt in our criminal justice system, that the burden of proof is on the prosecutor, not the defense.
Yeah, so this is just one of those other ways where Alexander Hamilton is setting the precedent for what would be American law for the rest of Americans' days. Like today, still, when court cases are decided, people will still quote the Federalist Papers and quote Alexander Hamilton and reference back to these cases that were being decided in the very birth of our nation. And like, even when he was still studying for law, I know we passed that point already, but some of his notes were so thorough as he was trying to cram all this information together that in that period of time, law professors actually took his own notes and printed them in a broadside to be used as research tools for people trying to pass the bar. They basically surpassed the textbooks they were using in being concise and being thorough at the same time and being able to actually be something you could research and learn from. So in all of this law practice that we're talking about for Hamilton, he is setting precedents and he is making history. And I think he really knows it because in this song, he's saying, this is the first murder trial of our brand new nation, the liberty behind deliberation. What we're saying here today is going to have a ripple effect throughout all of history.
So then you have Burr coming in, getting kind of upset again at Hamilton's attitude in that. Those specific words you just said there, the things that Hamilton says, comes with this assumption that he's the smartest person in the room, that he knows what he's talking about. And Burr gets frustrated with it. He says, why do you assume that you're the smartest in the room? And he ends that little part by saying, soon that attitude may be your doom, which is a little bit of foreshadowing to exactly what ends up happening again. Just like we see in the first interaction between Burr and Hamilton when he says, if you run your mouth, you'll get shot. This is another foreshadowing.
Yeah, I really like that point about how you have Aaron Burr constantly bringing up these little allusions to Hamilton being the cause of his own doom and maybe Burr being the one to kind of push that at the end.
Right. And you see that again in the next line. Why do you write like you're running out of time? Which is actually a good thing to point out that Hamilton dies relatively young, and yet we have this vast body of work that he left behind.
Yeah, he was always writing. He was writing nonstop. There was one story about him actually like scribbling off one chapter of the Federalist Papers seconds before putting it on the printing press itself, because he's just constantly going, constantly going. One of my favorite parts about that particular refrain, "Why do you write like you're running out of time?" actually comes up closer to the end of this song, where Aaron Burr and the people in the ensemble are singing, "Every day you fight like you're running out of time, like you're running out of time. Are you running out of time?" With that question at the end, where he kind of buried it in there with the, like, often when phrases are repeated over and over again, you kind of stop listening a little bit, and you like, "Are you running out of time? Like you're running out of time, like you're running out of time." And then you could easily miss that the very last phrase, it turns it into a question. "Hamilton, are you running out of time? Like, are you actually not going to be around for as long as most of us are?" And it's this ominous question to him that just, I love that turn of the phrase in that moment.
So yeah, Hamilton practiced law, and he had a keen sense of justice, taking unpopular cases and standing behind unpopular policies. And he would sacrifice to help others, taking in orphans, as we would see later in his life.
Mm-hmm.
So he had this keen sense of justice, so it made him perfect as a lawyer.
Yeah, he often did represent the people that were often looked down on in society. He represented a lot of, and this surprises a lot of people knowing his military history, he represented a lot of British loyalists, actually.
Oh, interesting.
Because a lot of the people who were being attacked and harassed after the war were those Americans who sided with the British. After this song is done actually talking about the law practice of Aaron Burr and the law practice of Alexander Hamilton, it kind of goes to the next chapter of this particular song. It covers a lot of things at once. Aaron Burr here, he doesn't do a whole new introduction of the scene, but he does say Hamilton at the Constitutional Convention. And so the next things are, we're going to look at their take on the Constitution, and then the rise to fame of George Washington. And then we're going to see what takes us into the second act. So here, he gets invited to actually speak at the Constitutional Convention.
I was chosen for the Constitutional Convention. You hear him giddily exclaim.
Yeah, I love that excitement like a child in that moment.
So the Constitutional Convention was from May 14th to September 17th in 1787 in Philadelphia. And the purpose of this was to revise the Articles of the Confederation.
Right.
Many, including Hamilton himself, sought to establish a new government rather than fixing this old one, though.
Yeah, so the Constitutional Congress had appointed these delegates specifically to go towards this new Constitutional Convention. They were supposed to go in and just revise the Articles of Confederation, patch it up a little bit, and let those be the new guiding principles or the ongoing guiding principles for the United States. The Articles of Confederation, remember, were all about this really weak central government that couldn't really do very many things, couldn't raise a lot of taxes, couldn't really summon the military to its own efforts. It basically relied on the states having all of the power, and the people at this convention decided those articles weren't really going to cut it if they wanted to have a government that would last.
Right, and so they drafted the Constitution. So there's 3 delegates sent from New York to this convention, Hamilton being one of them, and Hamilton ends up being the only one signing off on the new Constitution. The other 2 are for fixing the old form of government rather than replacing it with a new form.
Yeah, so remember that the Articles of Confederation basically loosely tied together these independent states to where the state governments were still the ones in charge. They were the ones that could rally the militia together. They were the ones that could print their own type of money, even if they were using different currencies in Virginia as they were using in New York. And so the states really had the power underneath the old government. The new Constitution was going to give a lot more power to the central government. They had this idea of splitting the government into 3 branches, the legislative, the executive, and the judicial, and some of that was getting ironed out at this particular convention. They had a gag order, basically, put together at the convention itself, where they said that no one was able to speak about what the others were saying, because they didn't want to make this about any one particular person when they came out of the convention. They knew the only way for this to work is if at the end of the convention, they were able to present one unified thing to the country. Even if people like the 2 delegates that came with Hamilton opposed it, they would at least come out with one particular platform that they were presenting as the new Constitution for the United States. And because of that, they would have something to send back to the states to get all of the people to vote on to ratify this brand new document that would totally restructure the entire system of government and bypass all of the state legislatures.
And as it mentions here in the musical, Hamilton gave a 6-hour speech at this convention.
Yeah, he sat down there without actually talking for a long period of this convention, and then he goes up and basically presents his own plan for, well, here's another way we could structure the entire government. Let me give you my own ideas.
And as Burr says in the musical, this gives free ammunition for his enemies. Why do you always say what you believe? And it's true. He basically says that he wants to establish a president who would be president for a lifelong term. And you could only lose that by being impeached.
Yeah, and the whole purpose of that gag order I mentioned was so that these bold ideas could be presented, so that people could go forward and say, look, here's this idea that I really want to try. Let's pitch this out. Let's try to debate it back and forth, see if this is a concept that would work for our government. And so Hamilton takes the reins, and he loves the idea of having a new opportunity to speak his particular ideas and to put it all out there. And so he does frame this really big, high picture thing with the understanding that he would not necessarily have to defend this one strategy of government for the rest of his life. But his political enemies happened to also be in that particular room with him. And so when they heard him talk about a lifelong president, an elected monarch, so to speak, they wanted to hold on to that little piece of evidence. And later when they were fighting, they decided to betray the gag order, betray the secrecy of that convention, and say, you know what? Here are the transcripts of all the things that Colonel Hamilton said. And they really don't let him live down the idea of him being a monarch, even though after this Constitution is drafted, he is really one of the biggest defenders of that Constitution.
Yeah, and in the end, the Constitution doesn't have any rules against the president being president for his whole life. It doesn't have a certain amount of terms that you can serve. But Washington ends up stepping down after 2, and he sets a precedent. And later that will be amended into the Constitution. I think it's the 22nd Amendment, but it didn't happen until like 1947.
Yeah, it was just a precedent that was followed for a long time because Washington set that pattern.
Which kind of shows a little bit why Hamilton is so surprised when Washington does choose to step down.
Oh, yeah.
So Hamilton decides to write these letters, the Federalist Papers, in defense of the Constitution, since not a lot of people are on board with it still. And in the musical, he comes to Burr in the middle of the night with this idea. Historically, we have no evidence of Hamilton approaching Burr to write in these Federalist Papers. And later, Burr would actually become an anti-Federalist.
Yeah, and the phrase Federalist, Anti-Federalist is a little bit confusing in general because it was going to be several years before America's first party system would actually start out. You'll see that in the second act of the show. But here, it's just one of those convenient phrases to talk about the Federalists being for the federal government and the Anti-Federalists being against what they were saying about the federal government. But really, since the Federalists actually won the argument in the end, they kind of got to choose the terms of the vocabulary and the whole debate itself. And so we do talk about the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists here, but it becomes a little convoluted because it is not exactly the Federalist Party that's going to be built that we're talking about. It's just, are you in favor of ratifying the Constitution or are you opposed to ratifying the Constitution? And it's worth noting that really neither of those sides were at that time necessarily villains.
Yeah, the Anti-Federalist people, the people that sided on that side of things, were just wanting to make sure that the people had a voice in this government, that the people were properly represented. And so they were for like the smaller state-sized government because they thought that would be a better way to do that.
Right. And it's really easy from 200 years later to look back with all of our history and say, well, yeah, obviously we want to have a 3-tiered government. Obviously we want to have a constitution in the United States. Obviously the Constitution matters to us as contemporary Americans. But we look back and if we take all of that history, then we're really being unfair. We're not playing the game by the rules of those days because they knew that in their own experience, powerful governments could be corrupted. Powerful governments could end up using their power much in the same way that King George had to basically suppress the American colonists instead of liberating them and freeing them. And since they had just fought this whole war for independence and for freedom and liberation, they weren't about to sign over all of their rights to a new type of monarch, a new type of government, a new class of bureaucrats who would be ruling in the place of King George.
So I like this part here in the musical where he's trying to convince Burr to help him write these papers. And Burr brings up, the Constitution's a mess. And Hamilton says, so it needs amendments. And Burr says, it's full of contradictions. And Hamilton then says, so is independence. Which to me just harkens that truth of, yeah, we won the war. We have independence, but not for everybody. There's still slavery.
Yeah.
There's contradictions here. Who's this freedom for?
Yeah, I really love the way that Hamilton kind of gives this whole sales pitch to Burr when he goes up and he says, Burr, you're a better lawyer than me. Burr just like, okay. He knows that he has something on his mind, right? Like,
what do you want?
What do you want, kid? And Hamilton keeps buttering him up. He's like, you're a better lawyer than me. I know I talk too much. I'm abrasive. You're incredible in court. You're succinct, persuasive. My client needs a strong defense. You're the solution. Burr asks the question, just like, get to the point. Who's your client? The new U.S. Constitution? Like, he gets timid, like, he has this sly grin on his face. I imagine, like, hey, yeah, this is what I'm actually here for. And immediately, just like Hamilton knew, Burr just says, no, just absolutely not. Hamilton gets under the fence. Hear me out. Come on. This is what my actual pitch is. I want you to write a series of essays anonymously published. They won't even know that it's us at first. We want to defend the document to the public. So when they're writing the Federalist Papers, they're for the purpose of getting the Constitution ratified in all 13 of the states. Hamilton wants to do this because he's faced opposition in New York. He's faced opposition in his own state where he was 1/3 of the delegates and the other two outvoted him. They were trying to force New York not to ratify the Constitution. So he was wanting to put all of these papers out in the New York newspapers so that they could actually read all of these supportive arguments in favor of the new form of government, the new Constitution.
So for any of our listeners who may not know, Robbie, why don't you explain what it means to ratify something?
Well, to ratify something is just to give your official confirmation, your agreement to something. So the Constitutional Convention was held and they came out with the document that basically gave us the Constitution. It didn't have the Bill of Rights attached to it yet. Some of the states came back and they rejected the Constitution and said if it had a Bill of Rights, maybe we would actually accept it. But they sent the document off to the states, and the people would vote to actually give their approval to it, or they would vote against it to basically reject it.
So in the musical here, Burr does a really good job of summing up what happens next. Hamilton joins with James Madison and John Jay to write the Federalist Papers, and there's supposed to be 25 of them, and it's supposed to be evenly divided between the three of them writing. But in the end, they wrote 85 essays in the span of 6 months. John Jay got sick after writing 5, James Madison wrote 29, and Hamilton wrote the other 51. And I love how the question changes here. Before it was, why do you write? And now we're going to see it change to, how do you write? No longer are people wondering his motivation. They're wondering, how do you even do this? This is insane, man. It's impressive how he could write all these essays. That is crazy. So the Federalist Papers came out, and the Constitution was in fact ratified. And while some debate about the impact that the Federalist Papers had on the Constitution being ratified, there's no question on the giant impact that they have had on the United States, even to this day.
So, as a slight interruption almost to this conversation about the Federalist Papers, where Hamilton asked Burr to write the Federalist Papers, and then he actually writes it with those other two guys, you have in the middle Angelica Schuyler show up on stage. And here she announces to Hamilton, they have this like brother-sister moment where they're holding each other's hands, they're walking across the stage, and she says, hey, look, I'm sailing off to London with someone. I found a husband. I'm ready to go off. He's going to keep me comfortable. He's not as funny as you are. Like, he doesn't have the same chemistry that you and I do, but he pays the bills. So you can tell, like, she's super enthusiastic, right?
Right. And actually, as we've mentioned before, in history, she was actually eloped quite a bit before this.
Right.
But in the musical narrative, this is where Miranda decides to put it to let you know that this has happened.
Yeah, and it's important to note that she's being sent off to London as the second act starts, so that whenever Eliza and Alexander have their falling out and the whole Reynolds pamphlet gets published, Eliza's sister, Angelica, is all the way across the sea. And so there's this distance, and they will keep their correspondence up over the letters, but they're longing for each other across the ocean, and they feel that distance that's really going to play a powerful role in the second act, I think.
Yeah, and as you mentioned, the person that she's marrying can't match wits with Hamilton, as she says. And Chernow actually mentions about him that his letters present a cold businessman, devoid of warmth and humor.
Yeah, it almost reads like an accountant, he said. Yeah.
So then Eliza shows up, and the interesting thing about the staging here is they have a rotating stage, and I think it's got like rings to it that rotate, and you can like stand in the middle and it be stationary, or maybe the middle can rotate as well.
There's two spheres. There's the inner circle that can either stay still or rotate with the larger circle, and then there's that outer ring that can either rotate around the middle or it can rotate with the middle. So it's like two spheres or two circles that'll actually rotate opposite each other or with one another.
And so Hamilton's standing, I think, in the middle as Angelica gets pulled away from him and Eliza comes up to him as the stage rotates. There's this interesting staging there.
Yeah, I like that. The contrast again, like we saw in the earlier wedding sequence and the Winter's Ball, where you see that tension between, is Hamilton going to get with Angelica or is Hamilton going to get with Eliza? And here you see that Angelica's being taken from him and Eliza's being given to him. And it is interesting staging that just kind of brings up a lot of questions, I think.
Yeah, and so Eliza asks, if your wife could share a fraction of your time, if I could grant you a peace of mind, would that be enough? Like, almost like question of, am I not enough for you? And then tellingly jumps straight back into the Federalist Papers there in the musical.
Yeah.
It shows kind of where Hamilton's mind is.
Right. And I like that when Angelica left him, her phrase is, don't forget to write. Because Hamilton is going to write a whole lot of things. Some of them as an actual letter to his sister-in-law. Some of them as the Federalist Papers and all of his other things that he just writes and writes and writes, because you don't need to tell Hamilton not to forget to write. He is going to write things.
Exactly. So in comes Washington, and he mentions that they're asking him to lead. They're wanting him to be president here. And Hamilton especially is wanting him to be president. Hamilton has attached himself career-wise to Washington, and it would be greatly in his favor. And he knows it if Washington would become president.
Yeah, but Washington really, after the Revolutionary War, he was resolved to be a farmer. He was ready to just dedicate the rest of his days to living his life in the shade and living underneath his own vine and fig tree. He wanted to actually just focus on his plantation, focus on those particular things. I read something about how he was actually a really innovative farmer, dealing with how you could crossbreed certain plants and get them to do some things that were really ahead of his time a little bit.
Interesting.
But yeah, he loved that. He wanted to rest. He wanted to retire. But everyone understood that his name coming out of the Constitutional Convention was one of the only things that could keep the United States really together, because he was now the venerated Virginian veteran, that he was really the one who could keep the actual country together, that he was the one who had the reputation and the gumption and the know-how and the following to unite what otherwise could have fallen completely apart.
Yeah, and we see this in the country voting him in unanimously here.
Right.
And even though Hamilton was so worried that Adams would actually win.
Yeah, so the Electoral College has always been kind of a complicated issue that's been it's caused a lot of problems throughout American history, no less today than then as well. But the Electoral College did basically unanimously elect George Washington, but Hamilton was afraid that because of the way some of the votes were being cast and the way the delegates were going to get two votes, they would put one forward for their president, one for the vice president, so the second place would get vice president. He was afraid that as the delegates gathered, that everyone would actually accidentally vote for someone other than Washington. They thought that that John Adams would actually pass George Washington in votes, because the delegates would basically be saying, well, everyone else is going to be voting for George Washington, so I might as well cast my two votes for the guy that I actually want to be vice president. And so it was an interesting little power struggle here, where underneath the table, Hamilton actually kind of worked against John Adams a little bit, and Adams figured it out later on, and it became a sore spot for their relationship. But at the end of this, you do see that George Washington is elected the president. John Adams is going to be his vice president, and Washington comes up to Hamilton, who was his right-hand man throughout the whole entire Revolutionary War. They had recently reconciled their differences a little bit, reconnected somewhat, and Washington goes up to Hamilton and says, hey, they're asking me to lead. I'm doing the best I can to get the people that I need. I'm asking you to be my right-hand man.
Yeah, Washington comes to him and it seems like he's prepared to argue with him over it, to try to convince him. And Hamilton needs no convincing. So as Washington is trying to convince him, Hamilton just keeps asking, Treasury or state? He's like, I know it's a lot to ask, Treasury or state. They'll leave behind the what? Like, Sir, do you want me to run the Treasury or the state? And he's like, oh, the Treasury. I didn't expect you to agree so fast.
Right. And it's not just that he's actually trying to convince him to do it. It's almost like Washington is actually trying to talk him out of it a little bit. Like, you have a lot of reasons not to do this.
Oh, yeah.
Like, you have a lot of reasons to not join the public life. You have a family, and you would have to leave behind the world you love. But Hamilton's not concerned about that. His brain isn't there. His brain isn't in, what am I giving up? His brain is in, what am I going to get out of this?
Right.
How is my ambition going to be served? How am I going to benefit? And I love that. You're right. The Treasury or state, Treasury or state, Treasury or state. Treasury Department is what he's running. Hamilton immediately says, let's go.
Which brings in Eliza saying, Alexander, almost this like cry of, what are you doing? I thought you were going to be here for me. And Hamilton says, I have to leave, which, I mean, he doesn't have to go too far. The government's in New York at this point. He'll be home for dinner. But it may say something about his time, that he has to leave. He has to be away from her and the child to do this job that's going to take a lot of his time.
And he will have to travel, yeah. And Philadelphia is going to be in play. He's going to have to go around a bit. So, yeah, it's a big choice. In the staging here, I think this is one of the most brilliant staging pieces in this show because we're towards the very end of the first act. We need something big to happen here. Washington approaches, and he's actually at the top of a staircase on the right, on stage left, on the audience's right side. And Washington's standing at the top of the staircase, singing down to Hamilton in the middle of the stage. And he's doing his pleading, like, do you want to join me? Doing that on that side. And Eliza comes in, and she's on the left side of the stage right, and she's looking down on him in the middle of the stage. And she's saying, couldn't I be enough? Couldn't I be the one you choose? And so you see at the top of two staircases are the people who personify Alexander Hamilton's two choices, George Washington and his wife. And so throughout this song, as the music is swelling and as the conflict is getting louder and as each of the main characters are coming on the stage singing their refrains, Hamilton, at the end of it, he runs up the stairs towards George Washington, looks back over his shoulder, and says I am not throwing away my shot.
Yeah, this symbolic ascension of power toward Washington.
Yes.
Up the stairs.
And it is specifically running away from Eliza in that moment. Even though they're absolutely united, they are not pursuing the same dreams in this place.
Yeah. Hamilton uses Eliza's own argument against her. Look around, how lucky we are to be alive right now. He'll then use Washington's argument. They're asking me to lead.
Yes, I love that parroting where Washington comes up to Hamilton, says, they're asking me to lead. I'm doing the best I can. And then he just turns his head and just echoes Washington's words saying, they're asking me to lead.
At which point you have all these different parts of the musical kind of start colliding in on each other. Eliza starts doing the look around. What would be enough to be satisfied? Angelica's singing, he will never be satisfied.
Burr singing, why do you assume you're the smartest in the room? And then Washington is singing over all of this, saying, history has its eyes on you. All of these refrains from the musical are going in, and then the ensemble comes on top, and they start singing nonstop.
Yeah, I love the way the music just comes together. There's so many parts of this musical are just culminating in this first act ending. You hear all these different songs, all these thoughts and ideas build up to this last moment where he again says, I am not throwing away my shot. And that ends Act 1.
We mentioned earlier that next week's episode is going to be a little bit special. It's our 10th episode in our podcast about the $10 founding father. So we're going to take that as an opportunity to share certain things that happened in the life of Alexander Hamilton up until this point, or around his life vaguely, that didn't quite make the cut into this musical, but that did take place during the time frame of Act 1.
Until next week, we would love it if you would join in this conversation with us. You can always email us at contact@graphocast.com or contact us on Twitter @graphocast. And if you would, go to iTunes and write us a review. That would really help us out. Until next week, I'm Vinton Bayne @FleshEater.
And I'm Robbie Hurlocker @Alpha Knight on Twitter.
Hi, I'm Sean Hancock.
And I'm Missy Hancock.
And I'm Vinton Bayne.
Together we are the Hancock Creative Podcast.
And we have a mission to encourage your creative soul. So we ask that you would come check out our weekly podcast and weekly pep talks, specially designed to encourage you.
The Hancock Creative Podcast is part of the Graphomania Podcast Network and can be found on iTunes, Stitcher, or at graphocast.com, GRAPHOCAST.com.